Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you. So welcome to our 15th program of this year. Hard to imagine. Yes, 15th program, we're only in the middle of April. It's a good thing. Last year we did 31 programs the entire year. Here we are only a quarter of the way through the year, and we've already done now half of what we did all of last year. What does this mean? It means there is a great demand for what we're doing. There's a great demand and many audiences that keep contacting us and asking us to do programs in their area. Last year we did our first program out of the state of Florida. We went to Atlanta, Georgia. This year we're doing 3 programs so far out of Florida. Last week we did Birmingham. Next weekend we're doing, in 10 days we're doing Charlotte, North Carolina. And then in June we're doing Atlanta, Georgia. We have programs, and we're waiting to set up programs in South Carolina, and now today we were asked to go to Indianapolis, of all places. So we're going to be putting in a program to do an event in Indianapolis, Indiana, hopefully by the end of the year. So again, though, what is this all about? It just means what MS Views and News does. We are something different than any of the other MS organizations. We're providing a specific need for the patients, and that is to provide you with education and allow you to learn more about the disease and learn how you can learn about the different medications that are available, A to Z, everything, not focusing on one medication. And that is who we are. So, now going a little bit forward. We want to thank tonight EMD Serono. They make Rebiff. We'd like to thank them for giving us the grant to do tonight's program, and I do thank them, and I hope all of you do as well. In addition to EMD Serono, our other sponsors for tonight are Accorda Therapeutics, who makes the Empira, the walking pill. Bayer Healthcare, who makes Betaseron. Biogen IDEC, who has Avonex, Tysabri, and Tecfidera. Then we have Genzyme, who produces Aubagio. Aubagio is one of the oral medications that I hope that you're hearing about. Then we have Questcor, who makes Acthar gel. And for those that don't know about Acthar, you'll be hearing about it tonight's program. And Teva Neuroscience, who has Copaxone. So, and by the way, for those that don't know, Copaxone's out in their new formula as well, so you may want to hear about that from the doctor too. So without going any further, sorry for my words here, tonight's program format, we have Brian Steingo, neurologist out of Broward County, Florida, who will speak first for about 50 minutes. If you didn't see the agenda, it's on your table. He'll be speaking for about 50 minutes about current and emerging therapies, adherence, dietary, and self-help aspects. It's 2 new topics that you haven't heard about. Then we'll have Dr. Valerie Masten. She's a neuropsychologist from the local area, and she'll be speaking about the impact of MS on the family, MS in relationships, starting a family. She'll be speaking for approximately 35 minutes. After the 2 of them speak, we'll do a Q&A. So we do hope that you'll hold off on all questions, write them down. Write it down on the back of whatever you have there. Write it down or send yourself a text message in silent mode, so that way you remember what you want to ask later on. So next up we have Dr. Valerie Masten, and she's from the local area, so if you do need to see her, she's right here. Come on down. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's
Thanks
yours.
very much. Okie doke.
He's putting yours on.
Excellent. Good evening. Tonight, I'm a neuropsychologist and a rehabilitation psychologist, and the focus of my portion of this evening's presentation is to talk about the impact of MS on the family and relationships. We're going to start off with communication, and we'll end this portion of the talk, again, coming back to the issue of communication. This really is the key feature to what is going to be helpful with relationships, is engaging in communication with all of those around you. We'll talk about different types of relationships, and this again being a key piece. Different folks have greater comfort in being open and talking about what they might be experiencing, others less so, but this is of course the key communication and the key message that I want to give to you is how can we improve and increase our level and our depth and comfort in communicating with others around us. When we think about relationships, there are a number of different roles that we fill. We have relationships with others who are our friends. We have our partner, significant other, perhaps it's our spouse. We have a relationship with our parent, with child or children that we have. We also have the role of being an employee. And each of these roles result in relationships that can be impacted by MS. We also all have responsibilities. The responsibilities within the family might change over time, over the course of the diagnosis. The responsibilities that the individual who's affected by MS might need to be adjusted. As has been said already this evening, there are some things that remain fairly easy for folks to do. Other things become more complicated, and there's a lot of variability in what those areas might be from one affected person to the next. Supports can be important, both in terms of relationships that we have with others, economics, different mobility aspects, adaptive implements that we might use that can assist us in maintaining our relationships with the fullest amount of autonomy, independence, and being involved in relationships despite having the illness. The role of balance is an important one. When someone is affected by MS and has some alterations in what they're able to do or the means in which they do the things that they do, this is going to impact the balance within a relationship. For a moment, let's talk about the relationship that we have with a partner, a spouse, our significant other. When affected and this individual becomes involved in one's care, they, of course, are impacted by the disorder as well. And in the relationship, perhaps it used to be the case that both parties were in good health, and now there's a change in the balance of the relationship because one individual is impacted because they have MS. The other party is, of course, impacted as well because they are the spouse or partner of the person impacted. The roles and responsibilities that existed, the balance of that relationship, how those individuals related to one another, what responsibilities the person who is impacted by MS has had may need to change. And that, of course, changes the relationship. The balance part that I'm referring to here has to do with the equality, basically, the roles that we have. When MS impacts that relationship, it becomes really important to maintain that balance. There may be some things that the person with MS is unable to do or unable to do at certain times that shifts that balance. I've indicated here that we need to have the give and take roles maintained. If it becomes the case that the unaffected individual becomes a care provider for the person affected, this can lead to some alteration in that balance that would need to be addressed. The person who's unaffected, the caregiver, the care provider, might assume a more dominant role in that relationship. And if that balance is not adjusted and maintained in some fashion, this can negatively impact the relationship between the couple. Self-care has already been discussed by our prior speaker, and I want to come back to this a couple of times in my portion of the talk. I said here we need to make deposits, and what I mean by that is that the individual who's affected by MS tries to continue on with all of the prior roles and responsibilities, despite the fact that it becomes very challenging to do everything as one did before. If we continue to give and not replenish ourselves, then this will affect the person with MS as well as all relationships that they have, regardless of whether it's with their partner, with their children, with their parent. In some circumstances, the affected individual is provided for by their parent. So the adult impacted by MS at times returns to the family circumstance, and care is provided for them by their parent. And this, of course, leads to alterations in those relationships as well, with struggles between that balance of autonomy, independence, being fully functioning. Sometimes the care provider can provide more care than what might be necessary, again, impacting that balance. So we want to strive to keep that balance with as much full independence as possible. So making deposits, if the individual who's affected is giving and giving and giving, and we need to make sure that there is self-care so that we attend to ourselves and give us the time to do the things that are helpful for us. For different people, it could be a variety of things. It could be involving oneself in social activities, keeping up with friends, religious or spiritual involvements and keeping those up and current, continuing to engage in leisure activities, maybe finding some new leisure activities that are more comfortable at this time. In all areas of cognitive functioning, we know that it is physical activity, social involvements, and cognitive involvements that are helpful, necessary for healthy brain functioning. And folks will ask, what kinds of activities are we talking about here? What are cognitive activities that are helpful for brain functioning? And this can be highly dependent on one's interests. For some folks, it might be bridge, talking with others about current events, reading books, doing Sudoku, doing Lumosity, crossword puzzles, could be a whole variety of activities. Emotional and cognitive symptoms that are noted in individuals with MS. And these are things that may be present. Not everyone is affected in the same way. So some of these may be present or present at certain times during the course of the disorder. Depression is certainly one. And this can be related to the primary impact of the condition on mood, on the areas of the brain that are responsible for mood. It could be a secondary depression related to alterations in functioning and roles and responsibilities, the impact of the disorder and coping with the diagnosis and the alterations in functioning that goes along with it. Anger is also a quite common impact of MS on the individual affected. Mood fluctuations. So some variability in mood, sometimes referred to as lability of mood. So having a variety of moods that maybe it isn't so apparent that something has gone on in your world, in your day, that leads to an alteration of mood. It can be a little bit more variable or sporadic, that moods might change. In a good mood now, and then feeling upset, agitated, or angry in the same day without any clear sense as to an event that caused those changes in mood. Fear certainly is a part of the experience for some that would need to be addressed. Anxiety. Concentration and memory concerns are fairly frequently found in folks affected by MS. And I'm going to speak just very briefly about some strategies that might be helpful. Again, I am a neuropsychologist, and so I provide assessments of persons who have some concerns in this regard. So neuropsychological assessment sometimes can be helpful to take a look at the difficulties that might be present. Attention, memory, mood, and other areas are typically evaluated. But let's talk more for a moment about what can one do. Let's say that one is having day-to-day issues with things like memory and attention. This affects daily functioning. It affects one's ability to maintain that balance and to continue to do the roles that one has done before. Might need some supports, might need to do some things differently. Some of the strategies are ones that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Writing lists, some people like to do sticky notes, some people keep a little memory book with them. For other folks, use of their device, their smartphone, is a strategy that can be helpful. And some of the training that folks who provide cognitive rehabilitation services do works to train people in the use of some of these strategies. Memory can be remediated. That is, we can offer some services to work around the memory difficulty. It's not that the memory is improved or returned, but how do we work with the memory that we have? Oftentimes this is by way of using compensatory strategies. So for example, you go shopping at the mall and you forget where your car is. One can use the smartphone to take a picture of the location of the car. You can, let's say that you have a doctor's appointment that's upcoming. You can, of course, post that in your phone with a reminder. But let's say that you also need to have labs done prior to that appointment. You can post multiple reminders for that same event in a sequence that is helpful. You can create task lists, grocery lists with reminder functions as well. So some of these are strategies that we can use to work around the memory difficulty that we have to maintain that, that balance again, so that we're able to do things, maybe using some supports that we didn't used to use. And they ask at the bottom here, what about the caregiver? Many of the things that we're talking about here impact the caregiver as well. So feelings of concern or fear for the future, wondering, how can I cope with this? How can I best help my loved one? Am I up for this? Do I have the skills that I need to feel that I have the competence to be able to help my family member? What do I, as the caregiver, what do I do with my feelings of fear or concern or anger? Why did this happen to us? So the caregiver, him or herself, again, whether it's the child of the person affected, the partner, the spouse, the parent, the friend, also is in need of doing self-care for themselves in order to be as available, accessible, and to, again, keep that balance in the relationship. We're going to spend a little time talking about intimacy, and intimacy is really very broadly defined. A lot of times when we think of intimacy, we think of sexual intimacy, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But intimacy is a much broader concept that has much more to do with the relationship and the quality and the depth of involvement in the relationship than it has to do with sexual functioning. For some, the diagnosis of MS can lead to greater intimacy. With intimacy, there is a degree of vulnerability that's necessary. When one is impacted by a medical illness, at times that illness itself can provide a necessary opportunity to talk about the impact of the relationship, how each person is feeling, what helps you, what is not so helpful for you, again, from both parties, the person who's affected by MS as well as the caregiver engaging in these conversations. So if in the relationship one is able, again, to go back to that communication and to open oneself up to genuine communication with a depth of involvement, then there is a potential for increased sharing and strengthening, in fact, of the relationship due to how the disorder itself is affecting the relationship and dealt with. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of MS on sexual functioning. Let's talk about that piece of intimacy now. Sexuality refers to how a person feels about themselves as a sexual being. Sexuality is much broader than sexual functioning and sexual activity. It has more to do with the thought process, how we think about ourselves, than about the behaviors, the sexual behaviors we engage in. So sexual functioning is how one performs sexually. It's the acts. The shift in emphasis to sexuality, that is how one sees oneself as a sexual being, the intimacy, the involvement that sexual functioning is the outcome of, is the area that can be focused upon in the relationship. some of the specific impacts of MS on sexual functioning are posted here. Most people have an impact on sexual functioning, most affected by MS. 73% is some of what the numbers indicate, and the impact is a negative impact in a variety of ways. Some of the impacts are gender specific. So if you look down for males, reduced erection and orgasm are fairly common effects of MS. And in terms of what do we do about this, there are a variety of approaches: medications, injections, mechanical supports. For females, the primary impact in terms of sexual functioning has to do with reduced lubrication. Reduced sexual interest are common aspects as well that could be addressed, again, depending on what the specific issue is for that individual. Numbness. Physical numbness, the direct impact of MS on nerve functioning also affects sexual functioning. Spasticity, bladder issues, fatigue are all aspects that are impacted for most. MS occurs most frequently in females who are of childbearing age. Females, again, being impacted 2 to 3 times more frequently than males. And so we want to spend a little time talking about what is the impact of MS on a woman of childbearing age. In terms of pregnancy, findings do not indicate that there are any appreciable differences amongst women with and without MS in terms of fertility, pregnancy itself, the delivery, perinatal complications or issues with the baby or the woman after delivery. There are no big differences between women with MS and those who do not have MS. For reasons that have to do with a variety of aspects of the physical condition, there seems to be a reduced frequency of relapse during the pregnancy itself, but an increased risk of relapse during the postpartum period or after the delivery. Medications typically would need to be adjusted because of the impact, potential impact on pregnancy, as well as on breastfeeding for the woman who chooses to breastfeed. There might be a need for greater assistive devices, some of this having to do with the fact that as weight is increased, the center of balance differs, and so there might be need for some additional assistive devices for mobility purposes. What's the impact on raising a family? I noticed when I was out there that one of the tables had some books that were written for children about the parent who has MS. So talking about, again, going back to the communication piece, how do we tell our kids that we have this diagnosis in a way that's going to be understandable to the child and that one continues to be engaging in parenting, which is you're engaging in protecting your kids, but you also need to engage in that good communication so that they're aware that there are changes in what you're able to do, in your energy level, and so forth. For kids, we need to consider the age of the child. What are additional responsibilities that might be helpful for them to assume? How much is too much? And a lot of this is going to depend on the individual child and the age of the child. Keeping the parenting role intact. Having MS may mean that there's greater fatigue, there are mobility issues, there might be challenges in transporting, driving, etc. The parenting role, these are parts of what we do, but the parenting role is much larger than the things that we do for our kids. And so the real focus needs to be on the instruction, the discipline, the teaching the child the important values and so forth, with less emphasis on those activities that maybe are more challenging now because of fatigue or mobility issues. Maintaining appropriate boundaries. Again, getting back to the issue of the age of the child. We want to keep the parent-child relationship intact, and that requires that the parent continue to be the boss, basically. What are some adaptations that might be helpful to cope with some of the alterations in relationships that come along with MS because of the physical issues, the fatigue, and also some of the mental or emotional impacts of the disorder? So mobility needs, home adaptations, again, to permit the greatest amount of autonomy is helpful to the relationship. To the extent that I can do things for myself, this enhances the balance aspect that I've spoken about a couple of times in the relationship. So I want whatever's going to keep me able to do as much as I am able to do. Chores would need to be addressed. Who does what? What happens when I'm okay to do a chore this week, but maybe tomorrow I'm having issues and I'm not so well able to do that? So creating some contingencies are also going to be helpful for what happens if today's not a good day for me and I can't do the activities that I would otherwise do. Transportation, driving with children, who gets them to the activities? Again, creating contingency plans is helpful. Childcare. What if today's not a good day for me and I had planned on going to the zoo? You know, how do we cope with these events? And again, a lot of it has to do with what the family as a whole creates as the plan. What do we tell the kids? What do we set up so that if mommy can't do it today, then what are we going to do tomorrow? How are we going to arrange it? Who are others that might step in to provide assistance? Personal care needs, leisure activities. We want to keep all of these going on, maybe with some different activities though. Variety of resources, healthcare providers, your various doctors or resources for assistance. Social service agencies might also offer some supports. Insurance, Centers for Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, disability are sources of information and support services as well. Financial legal experts would be consulted, again, with regard to family planning, for caring for others in the family in the event that my economics are impacted because I'm not as able to work or I need to go out earlier on disability. Behavioral health providers, cognitive rehabilitation services, support groups through a variety of local and national agencies, involvement with friends, Americans with Disabilities Act, being familiar with what it is that one is federally entitled to receive in the workplace, in the home, in rental communities, in other public locations, transportation as well. The variability is a big part of what is quite challenging about this disorder, because it might be fine for a while and then the next day there are issues and challenges. And so how does the family cope with that? How does the couple cope with that variability? And again, contingency planning. What happens when the person affected is less able to do some activities than what they are when they're functioning well? And as I mentioned, coming back to communication, the biggest impact for improving and sustaining and maintaining good relationships, whether it is with one's friends, one's partner, your children, your parents, is open communication. And at times, it's helpful to get additional supports outside of one's self. It could be spiritual advisors, at times it might be a mental health provider, a support group. Activities like this, you are, as was said earlier, you are all supporting one another by being present, and that is very helpful. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
All right, so the next portion of this is the Q&A, and I need you all to help me lose weight. I need you to run me around this room. You guys are going to use the mic. Dr. Steingo's going to come down and he's got a mic. And I'm going to run around the room and take your questions for whoever wants to ask them orally. If you want to write down your questions because you're afraid to ask it, then just write it down and give it to either me or Michelle or Jill back there. You can run around and they can run around also and get your questions from you. Okay, who's first? Oh, I saw a hand over here. By the way, you're not being videotaped or video recorded. You're only hearing your voice, all right? That's it.
My question is actually for the first doctor that came up. During a different discussion at one of these meetings, I asked the question, what was the chance of my passing on MS to my children? The answer that I got was 98% he's probably not going to get it, or my children probably won't get it. While you were speaking, you mentioned that our children are at higher risk. So what exactly is the answer to the question?
The answer is that both answers are correct. So if he said that your offspring have a 98% chance of not getting MS, your neighbor's offspring have less than 1% chance of getting it. So if we're saying your kids have a 2% chance of getting it, the neighbor's kids have less than 0.5% chance of getting it. So the risk is increased. So we're saying it's not a high risk because they inherit susceptibility, they don't inherit the disease, but it's a higher risk than someone that doesn't have MS. That's what it comes down to. And now what we're learning, most important message that you have to take home, if you have children, brothers and sisters, is the things I spoke about tonight. Vitamin D is important. Obesity to control. All these important factors are things that you can now prevent. Smoking, if you have teenagers, don't smoke. Learn about this. Show them, give them the article. Look it up on the internet, smoking and MS progression. So you can intervene and you can say, you have a risk. I have MS, therefore you are at increased risk. Doesn't mean you're going to get it, but your risk is increased. Now take care, do all these risk factors so you can reduce your risk further.
Next question's over here.
This is for you still. You talked about genes. I have multiple sclerosis, okay? What's the possibility of looking at my genes? And again, this is something might be off the wall, okay? But again, then you take another person that has MS and look at the genes that they have, okay? And then see what the comparison says. And basically, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's basically comparing them to two together and saying, all right, this is what they have in common. What is the possibility of doing that? And are they doing that?
Yes, they are doing that. So the answer to your question is very high possibility because they're doing it already. So there are, at the University of Miami, the gene department at the University of Miami, the genetics department is superb. It is excellent. It's been funded by the MS Society too, and they are doing genetic studies on people with MS. They are particularly interested in people that have more than one person in the family with MS. But anybody with MS that wants to give blood for them to study, to keep in their bank, they study the genes. They look at the genome, which is your gene pattern. They study and try and see what genes are prevalent in people with MS. And going forward, can we differentiate the type of MS that you have by the genes? Can we look at your genes and say, well, you have this kind of MS. Is there a pattern that's emerging in different people? So the University of Miami is studying that. And in fact, I don't know how far they travel, but they in South Florida, certainly, they'll send out someone to people's houses to collect their blood, to keep it in the gene bank. And they might even come as far as Orlando. I don't know. You could find that out. So at the University of Miami and in California as well, Dr. Hoese, these are excellent genetic studies that are ongoing and have identified to this point many different genes that are more prevalent in people with MS. So right now you can't localize it to one gene. There are many genes that are involved. And we're still studying
all
that.
Those genes, you can basically see what is similar.
Well, as time goes by, more and more, when you get more and more people involved, you might be able to localize certain facts about it, which people are more likely to get it. And more importantly, can we predict from your genes what drug you're going to respond to? We can look at your genes and say, well, looking at this pattern, this person is likely to respond to Copaxone, but not to interferons. Or this person can respond to something else, or this person might need a different kind of treatment. So going forward, these are things we're going to be looking at, or they're looking at. So there are a lot of genetic studies that answer your question, but there are so many genes that are increased in people with MS. The patterns are still being identified.
I got one more question. Dr. Valerie, is it possible of remapping your mind? And if it is it possible of improving memory?
I'm not quite sure remapping. I'm not quite sure how I would address that piece.
Let's put it this way. I mean, if I tell my toe to move over and over and over and over and over and over again, okay, that toe is going to move eventually because my brain is telling that toe to move. Okay, eventually it's going to hopefully my mind will remap itself to move that toe. And then the same way is basically, if I tell myself and I keep telling myself my memory is going to get better, it's got to get better, it's got to get better, and just have all the heart desire to, and it goes on and on and on. But is it possible of remapping your mind to improve your memory?
When we look at memory functioning, it is not the case that we're improving the memory per se. What we're able to do is to identify strategies that are helpful in supporting the memory, such as use of smartphones or other strategies that we can use to eliminate distractors in our ability to learn new information.
Yeah, last one.
Okay, no problem. But that's counteracting the symptoms. I want to be able to cure, or to make better.
Well, making better is absolutely the goal. Cognitive rehabilitation does improve functioning. But for example, with memory, if we assess someone's memory before learning strategies and we assess their memory after learning strategies on standardized neuropsychological measures, the test scores do not change. What happens though is that you learn a strategy that permits you to effectively go to the grocery store and to get all the items that you need. Or you learn strategies that permit you to recall, on my way to the store, I need to stop off at the post office. And afterward, I need to get back in time to get to the airport to pick up my buddy. So it's the functioning that is improved by means of the strategies.
Okay. That okay? Okay.
The articles behind you, the first one, the miracle marijuana and the research, I don't know what your take is on that, but what symptoms would it be treating? Because I see that it would just maybe make the person more fatigued.
Who are you asking? I'll answer. So yeah, in this, firstly, medical marijuana in the state of Florida, as you know, of course, is not approved. So if I prescribe it, you'll be visiting me at the local jail. Unfortunately, which is, in fact, in our local newspaper in Fort Lauderdale, the Sun Sentinel, there was an article just 2 days ago on the front page about prosecution of doctors who want to prescribe medical marijuana. So we're very antiquated with that, because you could go to Colorado and get marijuana for medical purposes if you want to. So what marijuana has been shown to help with MS is pain and spasticity. Those two particular symptoms seem to stand out that marijuana helps. On the other hand, they've also studied MS patients and shown that marijuana use on a regular basis affects cognitive function. So you might be pain-free but not so smart. That's what it could amount to. So what you can do is do a balance. I have patients who smoke marijuana, and what they do, for example, is they just smoke it at night. So they say it helps their pain and it helps their spasticity, and they get a good night's sleep, but they don't do it all day. So they have time, they're not abusing their brain all day. So I think if it became more and more allowed, and if more states allowed it, we could get more studies done. But that said, there are studies going on. Particularly going forward, what's going to be important is to use marijuana derivatives, not just marijuana, use cannabinoids, which are marijuana derivatives that don't make you addicted or high, but yet affect neurotransmitter pathways, so they could help your pain and your spasticity without making you high. So going forward, these are things we're hoping for. But for right now, pain and spasticity seem to be benefited.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
When you go and get a normal blood test, does your vitamin D reading come out of that and your vitamin B12, or do you have to request that specifically?
Right, so when you get a routine blood test, you would not get a B12 and a D. You would specifically have to make sure that your physician writes B12 and D. Separate tests, separate codes, they have to be requested. Sure.
Hello, I have a question. You mentioned sodium, salt
Yes.
intake, not to do too much of it. I'm not a salt person. However, this summer, I guess my sodium was so low that my neurologist was like, you really need to bring your sodium up. And I'm like, how do I do that? Add salt to stuff. And I'm like, I don't like that. So obviously, I'm not thinking they were looking at it as a neurological thing, maybe some other reason why my sodium needed to come up.
So there are a few answers to that. So as I mentioned to you, when they did this study, the way they measured salt was by salt intake. It wasn't by measuring the blood sodium level, which is a fairly narrow range. In these people, they actually measured the amount of salt that they had in their diet. And for example, let's say if the normal intake of salt in the diet is 2 grams a day, the normal recommended amount, if you quickly look at the things you eat, you'll see how quickly you get to that amount. It's staggering how much salt some things have, how much sodium. So I would say when you buy snacks and you buy any food, look at the amount of sodium in it. Buy low sodium products, much healthier for you. But there's enough sodium in the rest of your diet that usually your sodium level in the blood is good enough for most people. But in people that had more than 4 grams a day, their risk for relapses was 4 times higher in that study. But if you have low sodium in your blood, which is different from what they measured, which was the salt intake, if your sodium is too low in your blood, there's a normal range, say 130 to 135. If it's 120, you could have seizures. And you could have neurological problems, seizures, confusion, and things like that. So if your sodium is too low for other reasons, you might be on a diuretic, you could have medical issues causing it to be too low. It's usually a medical problem that makes it low. Then you might need sodium, like the example I gave of the one patient I saw who had a very low blood pressure and would faint sometimes from standing up. In that situation, you may need to take the sodium. So you've got to weigh it up with your medical problems. It will be an unusual situation where the sodium is low like that. Most people have normal sodium in their blood. But if it is low like that, then there could be an exception where you need to take a little more sodium.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Put your hand up higher.
Okay?
Halfway through the stick.
Oh,
There you go.
okay.
All right. Who on this side of the room has questions? M and J first. No, you do. No, you do.
No, I don't. Going back to the blood testing from Miami, when and how can we find out what's going on with that? Because I know I gave blood a year ago or something when this started, and how do we find out what's going on with that?
I mean, I'm not part of their study. It's the Houseman Institute. I'm sure you could call them. We could look up if somebody has a laptop here or something. We could look it up, and I could get their numbers, or I could give it to Stuart. Do you have their any information about them on your web page or anything like that? We could just put on the information about contacting the Houseman Institute for the genetic studies.
I can get her the information.
Yes, we'll get that information for you. The informant is standing behind you. We'll get it for you.
Yeah, she was really big. I became a part of it too, and I didn't use her up, but she was really big on the genetics. The lady in Miami. Because I have 2 cousins and 1 aunt.
We can't hear you, so we're going to have to wait till we get there with the microphone.
Yeah, right now, so you have family members that have MS, and they're particularly interested in that to see if there's patterns that run through families. So they're very, but there isn't all of it. But right now, it's mostly a gathering of information. And they have this massive computer that analyzes all the stuff, and they're looking at all kinds of different situations to try and see if they can find, patterns of involvement. I'd say it's still early, but we're getting information. The more people contribute, the more information there is, the more we're going to learn about genetics.
I want to let you all know I had the honor of being invited by University of Miami one time to their genetics program, and it's just phenomenal what goes on down there with the amount of research that's happening. And they showed me their little discs, their little glass trays, and there's like 40,000 specimens on each little half-inch piece of glass, and it's just incredible, and how they store these specimens and what they're looking for, and they showed me a lot of the diagrams of what they're actually looking for to see what's causing what. It's just very detailed. I'll get more information about it, and we'll get it onto the internet soon.
Doctor, can you go a little bit deeper on the salt? And as an example, does the salt block the absorption of any chemical on the cell, or how does the salt affect directly the MS?
Yeah, so the answer is we don't know the answer yet. It's the same as vitamin D. We've known for a long time that vitamin D was very important, but it's only in recent years that we've recognized that on the cell surface there's a vitamin D receptor, and that's where vitamin D is working. So we recognize that now. And with the salt now, these studies are only published in the last couple of years. We're not sure exactly how it works. It's clearly something to do with the cell itself, with the environment that the cell is in, but we don't understand why that is important for the immune system. We've known about salt for many years with diuretics and with heart disease and high blood pressure. So for many years, people said, don't have a low-salt diet if you have high blood pressure or heart disease. Now we're understanding it's also important for the immune system, but the exact mechanism, we still don't know that. We do not know the mechanism. Only the fact that it is very important, but not the mechanism.
So somebody gave me a question to ask him. What about, forget about adding salt to the diet, but what about salt that's already in foods? What do they do about that?
Well, you need to eat. So I'm saying you need to be looking. We spoke before. I said one of my slides talked about calorie and content control, and so we're saying you need to look at what you're eating. If you like snacks, make sure they're low sodium or salt free. And yes, maybe that doesn't taste as good when you start, but after you've done that for a while, you adjust to it. And so that's what you need to do. Cook with the least amount of salt possible. Don't add any extra salt. If you're eating and the food's not that tasty, we need to find other things to improve the taste of our food. We need to stay away. We need to avoid adding salt and use as little salt as possible to cook. And when we eat foods, look for the low salt varieties. We just have to become more conscious of what we're eating.
Question here.
Is there a difference between Himalayan salt and regular table salt?
I think any kind of salt, which is basically sodium chloride, this would apply to. So in the study, they didn't look at that. All they specified in the study is they looked at salt intake. So they didn't specify what kind of salt. I think as long as it's salt, they've got the same risks.
By the way, everybody's set on the MS and relationships. You have no questions. You all have a perfect relationship. You have no questions for the neuropsychologist? If you do, just raise your hand.
Okay, I want to ask the question you was talking about. Someone had asked a question about the marijuana thing. Since I never even smoked a cigarette, isn't that pretty much, can't that cause us to still have like things people get when they smoke? Isn't it? I don't know how that works.
Yes, I mean, marijuana can cause whatever problems that we know about. The main problems with marijuana are psychological and mental issues.
Okay.
I don't think
so
anybody's...
So it's no different than, so this kind in Colorado, is no different than the other one, isn't it?
Well, they have some different varieties over there. They have people over there that are obviously now opening factories and businesses and not only producing regular marijuana that you smoke in a joint, but derivatives of cannabis. They're called cannabinoids, which are different, which don't make people feel as high and which might work on transmitter pathways and not have all the bad effects of smoking it. So they have it in cookies. You can get what? I think you can get cookies of cannabis and all kinds of products like that. So going forward, this is going to be the future. It's not going to be smoking joints with those kind of effects. It's going to be using derivatives.
What was that called again? She asked what that was called.
Cannabinoids. Marijuana is cannabis. So the drugs that are derived from it are called cannabinoids. Spell cannabis and then add oids. Like droids, oids.
I got it.
Take out the S and add oids.
I got it.
Stuart's got it.
Wait, question here first.
Okay, I have a question on relationships. I am a person with MS. However, I have a really hard time getting my mother to understand sometimes when I have an exacerbation that there are certain things she needs to let me figure out and not panic. I have to tell her a lot of times, when you panic and you scream, it startles me and it stresses me out. How do I nicely let her know she needs to calm down? I know she's a mother. Everybody tells me that she's a mother. But any suggestions on how I can go about nicely letting her know, calm down, it's okay. I'm thinking about it. I got to process this by myself, or not by myself, but I need to figure it out because I do live alone.
Yeah, exactly. This is the piece of balance that I mentioned several times. A parent, their role for a very long time is to be the one who takes care of things. And whether it's an adult who has children, this is the same task. That is, when is the time that it is necessary for the development of the little kid that they do it on their own? And when the individual with MS receives some care or support by their parent. This is very challenging. It's challenging for these relationships regardless of the directionality. So if it's the older parent whose functioning is now impacted by whatever condition, who's receiving some care from their adult child, these reversals or alterations in the expected pattern of relationships are very challenging. A couple of suggestions that I would have. One is that in the moment when it's occurring may not be the best time to get this addressed. So a direct communication and conversation about this at another time is probably a good place. There are a number of materials that are available for the unaffected persons in our lives to give them some education about what's helpful, what maybe is doing too much, and thereby is not so helpful to the person affected. A very common type of circumstance that you're talking about. And like folks have said to you, it's your mom. You know, she's attempting to help. It's for the best of reasons. But again, a conversation when you're not in the moment is probably the best way to go.
Okay, next question's back here. We're going to get 2 questions here, and then I'll make it up front.
I have a question for each of you. Dr. Steingo, one of your slides showed a progressive scale, and you said that once people get to a particular point or number of years, the rise in progression is the same. Do you think that is cognitive or physical? If someone has physical disability, does the physical disability get worse, or are they likely to get cognitive disability as well?
So that scale is a physical scale. It reflects walking predominantly. It's called the EDSS scale. We use it in all our clinical trials. Every drug that we've spoken about, all 11 agents that are approved, everything you take for your heart or your lungs or any other condition, all go through clinical trials. And for MS clinical trials, we use the EDSS scale, which is predominantly a walking scale. And that scale basically says when you start to have trouble walking, then the acceleration can be very similar in everybody, no matter how long it took you to get there. So if you start to have trouble walking in 25 years, your rate of progression could be just the same. All of a sudden, you start to get worse at a more rapid pace. So we want to stop you getting to the stage 4 on the EDSS scale. It's a physical scale. On that scale, cognitive function plays a very small role. But probably the same thing would apply. You know, we didn't even talk about, there are such things as what we call invisible symptoms of MS. Right? How many people have been told, you look so good? Yes. The MS Society puts out a booklet that says, well, you look so good, or boy, you look so good, or wow, you look so good, or something like that. Wow, you look so good. But inside, you don't feel so good. You might have fatigue. I can't see if you have fatigue. I can't see if you have pain. You could be crazy. You could be psychological. You could be looking for drugs. You could have other symptoms. You could have loss of memory. Do you really have loss of memory, or are you just lazy? You don't want to work anymore. Disability sounds nice. So there are hidden and invisible symptoms of MS, and cognitive problems are one of those. They don't come big in this scale, but they're very significant symptoms. So probably just the same as there are physical problems going on, the cognitive symptoms, which for many years have not been well recognized and ignored to some degree, are very important symptoms. But they're not part of that scale. That scale was predominantly a physical scale, in answer to your question.
That leads me right into my question for Dr. Masten. Do you suggest, or what are your feelings about anybody with MS or everybody having some neuropsychological testing to use as a baseline for their cognitive abilities?
Neuropsychological assessment can be very helpful in identifying, you mentioned baseline. Some folks have impact that increases as time goes by in terms of cognitive functioning. It can be helpful to identify the types of difficulties that an individual might have. Neuropsychological assessment can be expensive, so unless there is a clinical indication, that is, there is symptom complaint that is presented to the treating doc, it would not likely be covered by insurance. So screening everybody who has the diagnosis would not likely have great utility and would not likely be covered from the economic standpoint. Some of the things when we look at neuropsychological assessment is that we would look at all areas of functioning, so attention, memory, psychological functioning, identifying if there are difficulties, what they might be due to. executive skills, planning and reasoning and judgment can also be impacted. And we know that one of the benefits of assessment is to identify the various factors that might account for that. MS being one of them, obstructive sleep apnea, pain, other sleep disruption, depression, are all additional areas that could be comorbid or go along with the MS that might themselves have bearing on the symptoms that an individual would have. Yes, it's helpful to have neuropsychological assessment, but then again, I am a neuropsychologist. Yeah.
I want to add something just to what you said, which is that sometimes, because it's hard to get, it might not be approved. If you complain of a memory loss, and we do a test just to show you have memory loss, might not always help us, because I'm going to tell you maybe the same things. Go and join Lumosity, or do crossword puzzles, or Sudoku, or do something to keep your brain going. But there's one time when memory testing is crucial. That's when you're applying for disability. If you're applying for disability and saying, I've got a memory problem, and I write that down in my report, Joe has a memory problem, they don't care about that. We need to document it. That's when it's important that we send you to a neuropsychologist, and it's documented that what your deficits are, that you have executive problems or attention problems or perceptual problems. It becomes crucial to identify and document it. So when we can document something and put it down clearly stated, it's greatly helpful when you apply for disability.
And unfortunately, sometimes the evaluations that you might be sent to are relatively cursory, and they might not pick up on subtle but very compelling challenges that an individual might have that are, again, sort of the silent, invisible symptoms that without detailed neuropsychological assessment might be missed, like issues with executive functioning, planning, reasoning, sequencing, flexibility. Most standard assessments would not include an evaluation of those skills.
By the way, for those that don't know, our program that we're doing here on June 21st, we're going to have a person talking about neuropsychological testing for the disability claims, and we're also going to have a disability attorney specialist that's going to be coming in from out of town to talk with you all about the disability laws.
Thanks. Dr. Steingo, I had one quick question regarding the vitamin D. My understanding was that the D3 was for better absorption. So is that probably the better of the vitamin Ds to take?
Yes, you're correct.
Okay.
That was easy.
I'd like to ask a question in regard to the genetics. Emma, really very little was known about MS until, 30 years ago, something like that. As far as I or any of us are concerned, our ancestors could have had MS, but we wouldn't know that because of the testing and the knowledge not being available at that period of time. And as far as the testing that is going on now genetically, you were saying that approximately 2% of our children may have a predisposition for MS if we have it in ourselves and in the family. But what I also wanted to ask was, what about other autoimmune diseases? Could that predisposition be caused not just from MS per se, but other autoimmune diseases and just manifest itself as MS or some other type of autoimmune disease? Not specifically MS to MS to MS to MS or other autoimmune diseases exactly as they are, like what's the other one? You mentioned it before. Arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. Couldn't rheumatoid arthritis come into another generation as MS? So you asked many questions that we could spend like the next hour. You all have time to stick around here, but I'll summarize them for you basically. So in the first part of your discussion, because there were many items, the first part, MS was originally described 150 years ago by somebody called Charcot, who was a very famous neurologist that described 150 years ago many different neurological diseases. So it was described 150 years ago. It was first called disseminated sclerosis 150 years ago. But you're absolutely right too, that we didn't understand MS much better until 30 years ago, because the huge advance in diagnosing MS was the MRI scan. That allowed us to diagnose MS. And of course now with modern techniques, we're much better able to understand it.
That said, though, there is no diagnostic test for MS. I can't do a blood test like I can for lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or Graves' disease, which are other autoimmune diseases, to diagnose them. I can diagnose those with a blood test. I can't diagnose MS with a blood test. And there are many conditions that mimic MS. So when I see someone that has potential MS, I have to do blood tests to make sure they don't have lupus. Because guess what? Lupus is an autoimmune disease that can affect the brain and the heart and the lungs and the kidneys and other organs. It's much worse than MS because many more people die from lupus than die from MS. So if someone has lupus, they could have manifestations and a brain scan that looks very similar to MS. And they could have both diseases. Because if you have MS, you have a higher risk of other autoimmune diseases too, as do other family members in the genetics. So autoimmune diseases in one family member, it means other family members are at higher risk, especially other female family members. These things happen. Therefore, we need to rule out all the MS mimics as well. But if you have one, you're at higher risk for others. And it's not unusual for people with MS to have Graves' disease and sometimes other diseases like lupus, or for somebody in their family to have that. One of the commonest autoimmune diseases associated with people with MS is Crohn's disease. It's very common for people with MS to have Crohn's or somebody in their family to have Crohn's. But all the others may occur with increased frequency too. Does that cover most of your questions?
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to take one here and one over there.
The lady in your discussion, you mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'd never heard of it prior to tonight. Would you mind explaining a little bit about that to me, please?
Yeah, absolutely. The Americans with Disabilities Act is intended to be protective of the rights of individuals who have disabilities, with disabilities being very broadly defined. Physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities are covered. And what the Americans with Disabilities Act does is to ensure equal access by way of law to services for individuals who have a condition that falls under the definition of disability. For example, some simple things: curb cuts. People who are using assistive mobility devices without curb cuts have challenges in getting up a curb. So under ADA, there would be curb cuts. Public facilities are required to be accessible by persons who are using mobility devices. Rules that govern the width of a door, or the number of restrooms or parking spots that are available at a public facility is mandated by federal law. Under ADA laws, an individual who is in the educational system, who is in the workforce, is entitled to accommodations that could include, again, depending on what the condition is, a whole variety of things. Additional time in the school system for activities, supports of voice to text, for example, would be another example. Someone who has a condition that results in fatigue might mean that they are entitled to periodic breaks. The process typically would be that the condition is identified in a work setting. It is the employee who self-identifies having a condition that they feel might be covered under ADA. Medical documentation, and then what would be considered reasonable accommodations is the term, are areas that are, again, federally directed for public facilities or that receive federal funds. That's a short description, but there have been a number of revisions, and again, there is law that is protective.
I can Google it and it'll come up?
Absolutely, yes. Uh-huh.
And you can come to the meeting in June and get all those answers too. All right. So our last question, and by the way, for anybody else that has questions after this, you could send an email to me and I'll send it to one of the doctors that the question pertains to.
Can you go one step further on the statement you were talking about Crohn's disease? And you said a lot of people with MS have it or get it. So I know that that's kind of like related to the digestive kind of sorta and bowels, and I'm not a doctor.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, Crohn's disease is an inflammatory condition of the bowel. People get diarrhea, abdominal pain, things like that. And I said MS is associated with an increased risk for autoimmune diseases. And one of the common autoimmune diseases that's seen more commonly in people with MS than people that don't have MS is Crohn's disease. That's what I was saying. Doesn't mean that you have a high chance of getting it, but you have a higher chance of getting it than someone that doesn't have MS.
Does it
So Crohn's disease typically involves the gastrointestinal tract, but sometimes can affect other organs. But most commonly it's gastrointestinal tract that is affected. Diarrhea, abdominal pain, those are the main symptoms.
Okay, so how about we give everybody a round of applause here? Yeah, you could thank me as well. Thank you for coming down, both of our doctors, and we hope to have you back again in the near future. Again, we want to thank our sponsors. Again, we could not do this without they giving us the funding that we need to get to provide these kind of programs, and we just want you all to know this as well.